Again, the skies over Israel lit up again today as Iraq fired another Scud missile towards Tel Aviv. It was the first attack in nearly a week. US Patriot missiles intercepted the Scud, but 25 people were injured by falling debris.
Patriot missiles were fired in the early hours of this morning as Israel came under attack after a week's respite. Saddam's missile was struck in mid-air, but the Iraqi Scud, loaded with several hundred pounds of conventional explosives, crashed into a residential area. Part of it landed intact in someone's living room. Several homes were destroyed. Rescue teams were quickly deployed to search the wrecked buildings.
This time Saddam struck at dead of night, just as people were beginning to relax after several quiet evenings.
Sniffer dogs were brought in to help look for survivors. These rescue teams worked in the aftermath of earthquakes in Armenia and Mexico. The renewed onslaught here has provoked understandable anger from local people against Saddam Hussein, though once again casualties were remarkably light.
The whole system is going down the drain, and we're going to have to do something about it. And we cannot trust nobody, no other country except ourselves, to do the job.
But this attack was no surprise, at least not to the authorities here. There's no sign of any change in the government's policy of restraint at the moment.
That will please President Bush, whose two top defence men are continuing their discussions in the Gulf on the timing of any land offensive. Secretary of Defence Dick Cheney and General Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, will take their recommendations back to Washington. Then it'll be up to President Bush to decide when or if a ground assault should go ahead.
With the war in the Gulf now in its fourth week, Mr. Cheney and General Powell are in Riyadh for a series of meetings which will determine its future course. The Americans, unlike other allies in the coalition, have not said publicly they believe a ground war is inevitable. And during his flight to Saudi Arabia, Mr. Cheney raised for the first time the prospect of a limited offensive on the ground, to draw Iraqi forces out of dug-in positions and then attack them by air. General Schwarzkopf, the American commander, is briefing the two men on the damage inflicted so far on Iraqi forces and supply lines. The assessment appears to be that airstrikes will have to continue for a little longer to make the job easier for ground troops if and when they're called into action.
Before troops are committed to a ground war, General Powell and Mr. Cheney will be gleaning an immense amount of information from Allied commanders. That'll cover everything from manpower to the phases of the moon over the desert.
When Defense Secretary Cheney and General Powell meet with military commanders in this war room, they will consider several factors. Military preparedness. Commanders say except for one armored division, the troops and their equipment are nearly ready. Most M1A1 battle tanks and attack helicopters have been positioned north, not far from the border. The Navy has increased its shelling of Iraq's shore defense positions in Kuwait. But the Air Force wants more time to bomb frontline positions, to clear minefields and blunt Iraqi artillery before U.S. troops cross the line. Another factor is weather. The heaviest rains in recent memory here have slowed down the positioning of ground units and delayed some air attacks. The desert is now drying out. Sandstorms are becoming a big concern. The position of the moon is also a consideration. The U.S. launched the air war on a dark, moonless night to surprise Iraq and take advantage of night vision capabilities. Next week, the moon will be dark again. Tides are also a factor. Marine amphibious forces would prefer to land at high tide when the distance across exposed beaches is narrowest. 6 days of favorable tides begin 1 week from Saturday. The Islamic month of Ramadan, which begins on March 15th, will also be considered. But the commander of Arab forces today said there is no problem with Muslims fighting during that holy month.
In the meantime, the United Nations Security Council has decided to meet formally next week for the first time since the Gulf War began. Britain and the United States wanted it to be a closed session, a procedure not used for 15 years. The UN Secretary-General, Pérez de Cuellar, has appealed to both sides in the conflict not to use chemical weapons and to abide by the Geneva Conventions.
Secretary-General Pérez de Cuellar focused his speech on the suffering people of Kuwait and Iraq. He spoke of his anguish and regret that all efforts to find a diplomatic solution had failed, and of the steadily worsening plight of civilians. He also used the Private Security Council session to outline the efforts being made to send supplies to relieve that suffering. The Pentagon, meanwhile, reiterated that the Allies are doing all they can to avoid civilian targets, whilst admitting that some civilian casualties are inevitable. The Americans estimate more than 10% of Saddam Hussein's tanks have been destroyed by the air bombardment. Many of the rest have been dug into shelters in the desert, and the Pentagon believes that will reduce their effectiveness.
Their tanks have been sitting in holes now for a long time. I don't know about their tanks. I'm not an expert on them, but I know if you don't get our tanks out and exercise them, if you don't foresight them, if you don't verify that foresight, if from time to time you don't fire check rounds to make sure that foresight is still true, they may not be in very good shape when it comes time to fight.
A comforting thought for Allied forces waiting for the ground attack to start.
In other news, in South Africa, more than 11,000 people have been arrested in the country's biggest crackdown on crime. Dubbed Operation Thunderbolt, South Africa's Law and Order Minister said it was aimed at ordinary criminals, not political offenders. Some 40,000 of the country's security forces swooped nationwide. Charges range from murder to drunken driving. In London, investigations into the IRA attack on Downing Street stepped up today. Police were stopping people in the street, asking if they had any information which could help find those responsible for yesterday's mortar bomb attack in Whitehall. Prime Minister John Major was at work as usual, despite the close call on his life. And forensic scientists were searching the area for clues, paying special attention to the remains of the van from which the mortar bombs were launched. On to sport, the New Zealand cricketers are one down in the Bank of New Zealand Cup series against England, but only after a stunning fight back by Ken Rutherford and Chris Harris. The pair came together when the Kiwis were in dire trouble and very nearly brought about a remarkable win. But earlier on, the Kiwi bowlers weren't so assertive. Cliff Joyner was watching the game.
Richard Petrie gave New Zealand the ideal start. First drop, Mike Atherton couldn't even get off the mark.
This one has bowled him.
The score hadn't reached 50 when Gooch misjudged this ball.
Oh, and that's another one for England.
Even Gooch appeared to lose interest in the game when Alan Lamb and Robin Smith pulled England out of the quagmire, both scoring easily.
The ball heads towards the boundary mid-wicket, it's 4 runs.
But their partnership ended unceremoniously.
No ball called, and that's beautifully stopped by Petrie. Oh, hang on, could be trouble, could be trouble.
Set 231 to win, John Wright and Martin Crowe got on with the job for New Zealand, but perhaps the pace was too fast.
Right in the air, he's going to be caught, should be caught.
Andrew Jones and Ken Rutherford started to rebuild the Kiwi innings until a fall led to Jones' demise.
And oh dear, I think he's run out.
Mark Greatbatch didn't last long. Ian Smith didn't last much longer. Young Kiwi Chris Harris showed he wasn't overawed with the responsibility of trying to save New Zealand from defeat. Rutherford and Harris then began the salvage job, giving New Zealand at least an even chance. Just when New Zealand was within reach, Rutherford lost his wicket. Harris followed soon after, and victory slipped from New Zealand's grasp. Cliff Joyner, One Network News.
So bad luck for our cricketers. Maybe they had better fortune with Lotto. Tonight's winning numbers being 18, 20, 22, 28, 33, 34 and the bonus number 7. Now here's Jim to update tomorrow's weather.
Thanks, Tom. Well, despite a bit of action out in the Tasman Sea, most of us will have another fine day. High still sits out to the east. It'll push a ridge of high pressure back across the country, keeping all this nasty stuff away. But there's also a very weak front coming in. That'll bring some rain to the southern west coast. So on the North Island tomorrow morning, some low cloud and drizzle will appear first thing between New Plymouth and the Kapiti coast. That will soon clear. The fine weather will take over. And of course, those sea breezes will spring up in the afternoon. Watch that sun too, because it'll be up around 30 on the east coast. And some more light frontal rain will reach the southwest of the mainland, but elsewhere early drizzle will clear the Buller and Nelson areas, and it'll be fine and warm in the east with a warm northwesterly breeze. Temperatures well up on the south too. We're expecting around 30 degrees in Blenheim. Sleep tight.
Thanks, Jim. That's One Network News for now. I'll be back with the Gulf News update at midnight, and don't forget our One Network News special at 8 tomorrow morning. In the meantime, good night.